Can I ask you something a little embarrassing? Daniel leaned against the wooden fence separating their yards, his voice low as if he were afraid the wind might carry his words too far. His neighbor Emily looked up from her garden, surprised. He had never asked her anything so personal before. "I think I want to start dating again," he said, trying to keep his composure. A long silence followed. She didn't laugh, she didn't nod, she just looked at him longer than usual. "What?" Daniel snapped. She replied slowly, "Then why do you still set a second plate for someone who's gone?" Daniel Hayes was 36 years old, but his posture often suggested he carried the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. He was a man of steel-gray discipline and mechanical habits. Every morning at exactly 5:30 a.m., he prepared a balanced breakfast for his 7-year-old daughter, Lily. He worked as a senior logistics coordinator, a job that allowed him to manage thousands of moving parts with a cold, analytical precision. To the outside world, Daniel was the strong single dad, the man who had flawlessly navigated the devastating loss of his wife, Sarah, 3 years ago. But inside the walls of his quiet, suburban home, the air was heavy with a history that refused to fade into the background. Daniel was a man of long shadows and even longer silences. He spoke only when necessary, and his social circle had withered until it consisted only of his daughter and a few transactional colleagues at the office. He didn't attend neighborhood barbecues, he didn't go to bars, and he certainly didn't talk about the hollow ache in his chest. He lived by a singular, desperate philosophy. If he kept moving fast enough, the grief would never be able to catch up. There was, however, one ritual he could never abandon, no matter how much it hurt. Every single evening at exactly 6:30 p.m., Daniel would set the dinner table. He would place Lily's colorful plastic plate at the head. He would place his own ceramic plate to the right. And then, with a trembling hand, he would reach into the back of the cupboard and pull out a second ceramic plate, a white one with a delicate blue rim. Sarah's favorite. He would place it across from him, set a glass of water beside it, and lay out a cloth napkin. He didn't do this because he believed she was physically there. He did it because the empty space on the table felt like a physical wound, and the plate was a bandage he refused to remove. The second plate was a symbol of a life that had frozen in time on a rainy Tuesday 3 years ago. Lily noticed it every single night. She would look at the plate, then at her father's haunted eyes, but she never dared to ask. At 7 years old, she already understood that some silences are meant to be protected. Across the fence lived Emily. She was a landscape designer, a woman who understood that for things to grow, old roots often had to be cleared away. For 3 years, Emily had watched Daniel from her kitchen window. She saw him mowing his lawn with military precision even in the twilight. She saw him walking Lily to the school bus, his shoulders hunched as if shielding his daughter from an invisible storm. And through the sheer lace curtains of his dining room, she saw the two plates. Every single night. Emily wasn't a nosy neighbor by nature. She was a woman who understood the language of loss through her own scars. She had always kept a respectful, supportive distance, offering only friendly waves or the occasional plate of cookies left on his porch. But Emily carried a secret that had been burning a hole in her conscience since the day Sarah passed away. She had been waiting for Daniel to take a step, any step, toward the light. One humid evening, Daniel finally reached a breaking point. The loneliness, which had once been a dull, manageable ache, had sharpened into a suffocating pressure. He looked at his reflection in the hallway mirror and saw a stranger, a man who had become middle-aged far before his time. He decided he needed to change. He needed to find a connection, if only to prove to himself that he was still alive. He saw Emily in her garden, pruning her roses in the soft amber glow of the setting sun. He walked to the fence, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He asked for her advice, expecting a simple, encouraging "good for you" or a suggestion for a dating app. Instead, Emily's question about the second plate hit him like a physical blow to the sternum. The air between them grew instantly cold. Daniel felt exposed, stripped of the emotional armor he had worn for over 1,000 days. He looked at her, his jaw tightening so hard it ached. "That is none of your business, Emily," Daniel whispered, though his voice lacked the conviction he desperately wanted. "You're right," Emily said softly, her eyes filling with a strange, knowing sadness. But if you're still feeding a ghost, Daniel, you simply don't have room at your table for a living woman. You're asking for advice on how to run when you haven't even learned how to stand still without her. Daniel turned and walked back into his house without another word. He slammed the door, leaning his back against it as his breath came in ragged, panicked gasps. He looked at the dining table. The two plates were sitting there, mocking him. For the first time in 3 years, the sight of the blue-rimmed plate didn't bring him comfort. It brought him a terrifying clarity. He realized that the neighbor he barely knew had seen through his greatest, most carefully guarded lie. Before we continue, tell us where you were watching from in the comments below. The days following the encounter at the fence were a blur of internal agony. Daniel felt a burning, irrational resentment toward Emily. He felt violated, as if she had reached through his windows and stolen something private from his soul. He began to avoid his own backyard, keeping Lily inside even when the spring weather was perfect. He tried to erase Emily's voice from his head, but her words were like a recurring fever dream he couldn't break. Why do you still set a second plate for someone who's gone? The psychological pressure began to manifest in his daily routine. At work, he missed a major shipping deadline for the first time in 10 years. His supervisor called him into the office, expressing concern about his distant behavior and lack of focus. Daniel brushed it off as stress, but the cracks in his carefully constructed reality were deepening. At home, the tension was even worse. Lily was becoming more observant and more vocal. One night, as Daniel reached for the second plate, Lily didn't move to help him. She just stood there, her small hand resting on his forearm. "Daddy?" she asked, her voice sounding older than 7. "Yes, Lily, what is it?" "Does Mommy get hungry in the stars?" Daniel froze. The ceramic plate in his hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He looked at his daughter, her curly hair, her inquisitive green eyes that looked so much like Sarah's, it made his breath hitch. He realized that his ritual wasn't just keeping him stuck in the past. It was confusing his child. He was teaching her that the dead never truly leave, which meant she could never truly begin to heal. "No, sweetie," Daniel managed to choke out, his throat tight. "She doesn't get hungry anymore." "Then why do we always give her a plate? Is it because you think she's coming back for dinner?" Daniel didn't have an answer. He set the plate down anyway, but his hand shook so violently that the ceramic clattered against the wood with a sharp, ugly sound. Driven by a desperate need to prove Emily wrong and regain control, Daniel decided to force himself into the world. He downloaded a dating app, spent an hour choosing photos that made him look like a happy, adjusted father, and matched with a woman named Claire. She was a corporate attorney, intelligent and attractive. They agreed to meet for coffee on a Saturday afternoon. The date was a total disaster from the moment they sat down. As Claire talked about her career, her travels to Europe, and her love for independent films, Daniel found himself mentally checking the clock every 2 minutes. He wasn't listening to her words. He was listening for the ghost of Sarah's laugh. He felt like a fraud, an imposter sitting in that bright coffee shop. Every time Claire smiled or touched his hand, he felt a wave of crushing guilt, as if he were committing an act of high treason. "Are you okay, Daniel?" Claire asked, her brow furrowed in genuine concern. "You seem like you're miles away." "I'm fine," Daniel lied, his voice flat. "Just a long week at the office." But he wasn't fine. He looked at the empty chair across from Claire, and for a split second, he didn't see a potential partner. He saw the blue-rimmed plate sitting there, demanding his loyalty. He excused himself abruptly and practically ran to his truck, leaving a confused and hurt woman behind. He drove home in a daze, the realization finally sinking in. Emily was right, he wasn't dating. He was searching for a replacement for a void that was never meant to be filled by a stranger. He was trying to build a new life on a foundation made of old, crumbling memories. That night, he sat in the dark dining room. He looked at the two plates. He didn't eat, he didn't move. He felt trapped between two worlds. The past he couldn't let go of, and the future he was terrified to enter. He saw Emily through the windows, sitting on her porch, her silhouette framed by the amber glow of a lantern. She wasn't looking at him. She was just existing in the present, while he was drowning in the yesterday. The tension inside him reached its peak. He wanted to go over there and scream at her for ruining his peace. He wanted to ask her how she dared to speak to him that way. But deep down, in the silent place he never visited, He knew he was angry because she had told him the truth, and the truth was the only thing his logistics brain couldn't manage. Daniel Hayes was a man holding onto a ghost with both hands, unaware that by doing so, he was slowly letting go of the only person who was still breathing beside him. Have you ever been judged unfairly? Comment respect. If you understand. The sky over the suburb turned a bruised, sickly purple on a Tuesday evening. The local news had issued warnings of a once-in-a-decade storm, but Daniel had ignored the sirens and the alerts. He was too deep in his own internal weather. He was trying to organize Lily's school folders, his hands moving with a frantic, nervous energy that bordered on mania. The rain started suddenly, not as a gentle drizzle, but as a violent deluge that turned the streets into rushing rivers within minutes. Thunder rattled the window panes in their frames, and lightning illuminated the living room in jagged, terrifying bursts of white light. "Daddy, I'm cold," Lily said, shivering on the sofa despite the blanket. Daniel walked over to her and touched her forehead. His heart nearly stopped. She wasn't just cold, she was burning. Her skin was dry and hot, and her eyes were glazed with the fog of a high fever. "It's okay, Lily. I'm going to get you some medicine," Daniel said, his voice high and tight with a familiar panic. He ran to the bathroom, but the cabinet was empty. In his obsession with his rituals and his work, he had forgotten to restock the basic children's fever reducer. He looked at the clock. It was 9 p.m. He looked at Lily, who was now beginning to moan in discomfort, her small body shaking. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He wrapped her in a heavy wool blanket, scooped her up, and ran out to the garage. He backed the truck out into the blinding rain. The wipers couldn't keep up with the sheets of water. As he reached the end of the driveway, a massive branch from a neighbor's oak tree crashed down with a deafening crack, blocking the road entirely. Daniel slammed on the brakes, his tires hydroplaning. He tried to shift into reverse, but the engine let out a sickening, metallic whine and died. "No, no, no, not now," Daniel screamed, hitting the steering wheel until his knuckles bled. He tried to turn the key again and again, but the truck remained dead and silent. He looked at Lily in the passenger seat. She was barely conscious now, her breathing shallow and fast. The fear that Daniel had been running from for 3 years, the fear of being unable to save the person he loved, finally caught him. The fear of being alone in the dark with a fading life. He felt himself spiraling into a full-blown panic attack. He couldn't breathe. The walls of the truck felt like they were closing in. Suddenly, a bright flashlight beam cut through the rain. A figure in a yellow raincoat was running toward the truck through the mud. It was Emily. She ripped the passenger door open. "Daniel, what's happening? Why are you sitting in the dark?" She's burning up. The truck. I can't get her out," Daniel stammered, his eyes wide and wild with terror. Emily didn't hesitate for a single second. She grabbed Lily from the seat, protecting her from the rain with her own body. "My car's in the garage. It's a 4x4. We're going now. Move, Daniel. Get in." Daniel followed her like a dazed child, his limbs heavy and numb. They scrambled into Emily's SUV. She navigated the flooded, debris-strewn streets with a calm, surgical focus that Daniel couldn't comprehend. She called the hospital on speakerphone while she drove, giving them Lily's vitals and their estimated arrival time. In the back seat, Daniel held Lily's hand, his fingers interlaced with hers. He was shaking so violently his teeth were charing. "I can't lose her," he whispered over and over like a prayer. "I can't lose her too. Please, Era, don't take her." Emily looked at him through the rearview mirror, her gaze steady. "You aren't going to lose her, Daniel. Focus on her pulse. Stay in the present. Sarah isn't taking her anywhere." They reached the emergency room just as the storm reached its peak. Nurses rushed out with a gurney, whisking Lily into the bright, sterile chaos of the trauma bay. Daniel tried to follow, but a security guard firmly held him back. He collapsed into a hard plastic chair in the waiting room, his head in his hands. He felt like a total failure. He had spent 3 years setting a plate for a dead woman, but he couldn't even keep enough medicine in the house for his living daughter. He had been so focused on protecting a memory that he had almost neglected the miracle standing right in front of him. Emily sat down next to him. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't offer empty, sugary platitudes. She just handed him a cup of hot, bitter hospital coffee and sat in a supportive silence. 2 hours passed. The doctor emerged, a tired but kind smile on his face. She's stable. A severe viral infection triggered a febrile seizure. We've brought the fever down with an IV. She's sleeping now. You can see her. Daniel felt the air finally return to his lungs. He walked into the recovery room and saw Lily, her face pale but her breathing deep and steady. He sat by her bed and took her hand. He looked at her small, fragile fingers and realized something profound that changed his entire perspective. He wasn't holding Sarah's hand. He was holding Lily's. And Lily was the only future he had left. He looked at Emily, who was standing in the doorway, her hair damp and her face weary. Daniel realized then that she hadn't just saved Lily, she had saved him from the abyss of his own making. He looked at his hand, still gripping Lily's, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt a sense of absolute clarity. He was done with ghosts. He was ready to be a father to the living. Do you think real love sometimes chooses sacrifice over survival? Tell us below. The hospital room was quiet, lit only by the soft, rhythmic glow of the heart monitor. Lily was sleeping deeply, her fever finally gone. Emily was preparing to leave, her yellow raincoat draped over her arm. "Emily, wait," Daniel said, his voice low and raspy from the night's events. She stopped at the door. "How did you know?" Daniel asked, looking at her. "The second plate. How did you know I was doing that? My curtains are thick. I'm careful about what people see." Emily turned back to him. She sat on the edge of the second bed, her expression softening into something Daniel hadn't seen before, a look of profound, long-term empathy. "I didn't have to see it through your windows, Daniel," she said softly. "Then how?" "Because Sarah told me you would do exactly that." Daniel felt the world tilt on its axis. "What? You knew Sarah? You were friends?" "I was," Emily whispered. "The last month while you were at work and she was still at home. I used to come over. We spent hours in her garden. She was terrified, Daniel, not of dying, but of what her death would do to your spirit." Emily reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was yellowed and worn at the edges, as if it had been handled many times. "She told me you were a man who lived by a routine," Emily continued. "She said you would try to keep her alive by keeping the house exactly the same. She knew about the plates, she knew about the silence, and she made me promise one thing." Emily handed him the paper. Daniel opened it with trembling fingers. It was Sarah's handwriting, elegant, looping, and full of the life she had once possessed. "To my neighbor and friend Emily. If he ever tries to move on, don't let him lie to himself. He will try to hide behind my memory because he's afraid of the light. Tell him that I'm not in the house anymore. I'm in Lily's laughter. Tell him to break the second plate. Not because I'm forgotten, but because I'm finally free. Please, Emily, don't let him die while he's still breathing." Daniel read the words over and over until they blurred into a smudge of ink. The embarrassing question at the fence wasn't an insult. It wasn't a judgment. It was a rescue mission. Emily hadn't been attacking him. She had been keeping a 3-year-old promise to a dying woman who loved him more than her own life. Daniel began to sob. It wasn't the quiet, controlled weeping he was used to. It was a raw, guttural release of 3 years of repressed agony and hidden love. He cried for the wife he missed. He cried for the 3 years he had wasted as a ghost. And he cried for the incredible, secret gift that Sarah had left him through a neighbor. Emily didn't move. She didn't try to comfort him with empty words. She just let the storm pass. She had carried this secret for 1,000 days, waiting for the exact moment Daniel was ready to hear it. "She loved you so much, Daniel," Emily said softly, her own eyes misting over. "She wanted you to live, really live." Daniel looked at the note, then at the sleeping Lily, and then at Emily. He realized that Sarah hadn't just left him a daughter, she had left him a guardian. He saw Emily not as the neighbor he resented, but as the bridge Sarah had built to lead him back to the world of the living. Do you think Daniel knows what he really did? Tell us below. A week later, the air was crisp and clear, the fresh scent of the rain still lingering in the green grass of the suburbs. Daniel stood in his kitchen, preparing a simple dinner of pasta and a fresh salad. He moved slowly, his mind finally at peace. He reached into the cupboard. He saw the white plate with the blue rim. He touched the edge of it, remembering Sarah's face the day she bought the set. He smiled, a real, warm, and happy smile. He took the plate out, but he didn't set it on the table. Instead, he walked to the hallway closet, wrapped the plate carefully in soft tissue paper, and placed it in a wooden box filled with old photos and Sarah's favorite silk scarf. He tucked the box onto the top shelf. It was no longer an everyday burden. It was a cherished memory. He walked back to the dining table and set only two places, one for himself, one for Lily. "Dinner's ready, Lil," he called out, his voice echoing with a new energy. Lily ran into the room, stopping short when she saw the table. She looked at the empty space where the second plate usually sat. Then she looked at her father. "Is Mommy not hungry tonight, Daddy?" she asked cautiously. Daniel knelt down and looked her in the eyes. "Mommy is fine, Lily. She's watching us from the stars, and she's very happy. But tonight it's just you and me, and maybe a guest who helped us out." A soft knock sounded at the back door. Emily was standing there, holding a bowl of fresh tomatoes from her garden. She looked hesitant, but Daniel opened the door wide, a genuine smile on his face. "We have an extra chair," Daniel said, his voice clear and welcoming. "If you're hungry, we'd love the company." Emily smiled, and for the first time, the fence between them felt like it had completely vanished. They sat at the table, the three of them. There were no ghosts at the dinner. There were no second plates. There was only the sound of Lily's laughter, the smell of fresh herbs, and the beginning of a conversation that would last for years to come. Daniel looked at his daughter and then at Emily. He realized that Sarah hadn't been replaced. Her love had simply evolved. It had moved from the plate to the people. He felt a lightness in his chest he hadn't known in years. He was no longer a man waiting for the past to return. He was a father living for the future. Healing doesn't come from forgetting the people we've lost. It comes from accepting that their love wants us to move forward. Grief is a room we must walk through, but it is not a room we are meant to live in for the rest of our lives. True love doesn't demand that we stay broken in their honor. It demands that we find the courage to be whole again. Sometimes the people who push us to face the truth are the ones who love us the most. And sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to fully embrace the living. If you believe that love doesn't end when someone is gone, but simply changes form, comment "Love lives on" below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel Hidden Heart Stories for more powerful, true, and inspiring stories that remind us of the strength of the human spirit.